Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Greg Suprock. I'm the head of solutions architecture at Apex Covantage. The conversation that we're going to have this afternoon concerns the importance of creating born accessible digital content and compliance for accessibility purposes in 2021. I do have a slide deck that I'll work through for the presentation, and then we'll be able to have some time at the end of the conversation for some question and answers. Here's an outline about what I'm going to cover during the talk this afternoon. We'll talk about accessibility mandates. This will be an overview generally of the pressures that are internationally being put to develop accessible content and then have publishers and others conform to those requirements. Many of these mandates are legal efforts that have been put into place, and I'll share what some of those are. I'll talk about what it means going accessible. We'll take a look at legacy content. We'll take a look at some new content or materials that would be frontless content for publishers. We'll talk very briefly about some of the specifications. I designed the presentation not to be technical in terms of depth, but would be willing to welcome those kinds of questions during the follow-up session. Or if you wish to get in touch with us, there's contact information later that we could discuss with you. I cover document specifications because we're focusing on books here, while the accessibility mandates do cover a range of things. I'll talk a little bit about what is involved in assessing whether your files, whether your documents are accessible, and then I'll provide you with some resources that you would be able to reference as URLs. And then finally, there's a brief section that I won't go through in detail at the end of the deck, but the deck will be available later. This describes Apex Content Solutions if you haven't gotten that information from folks inside of our booth. So the first section that we're going to talk about today are accessibility mandates. There are 4 mandates that I want to make you aware of that cross the European Union, UK, Canada, and the US. These mandates cover a broad range of items. The key element for us to be able to focus on is what happens in terms of web content. In the United States, there is a federal legislation around Section 508, and it's titled Section 508 Refresh, which happened just a couple of years ago, that impacts all federal agencies. What this requires is support for those agencies to enable accessible documents for all individuals that are going to be seeing those public-facing documents and working with them. It also requires a series of other types of support services. In fact, if one is providing services or working with the federal government, it's necessary for your organization to comply with being able to deliver materials that are going to be accessible. If you're a software provider, that means you have to be able to provide software that is going to be accessible and then can be used in a wide range of activities. It covers all websites that are hosting digital documents, and it covers the digital documents themselves. And if those of you who are on the session today have taken a look at some of the requirements for bid work that is for either the Library of Congress or for other federal organizations, there will be a section included there if you're delivering files that will specify the accessibility requirements and the types of documents that one needs to deliver. This covers not only work that is fresh and born live, it also covers materials that would be created through conversion, through remediation projects. So if your organization has a large quantity of work and the federal government wants to be able to have access to it, or an academic institution that is getting grants from the federal government wants to have access and make those materials digital, you may be asked to ensure that they are going to be accessible as well. In the United States, there has been some legal action that has been taking place brought by end users against academic institutions and libraries under different types of Section 508 rules or baby 508 rules. Baby 508 rules would be those rules that are associated with accessibility requirements on each of the state levels. In some of those cases, the litigants had won, and it required then that publishers needed to be able to work with libraries to make the materials that had been supplied to the libraries in an accessible format. The European Union has a similar type of initiative. It's a directive on web accessibility under the European Accessibility Act. The guidelines in the European Union are very much the same. There's a high level of activity where these need to be met during the course of 2020. And these are all driven and associated with an agreement that was made in the European Union called the Marrakesh Agreement, which mandates that published materials are going to need to be made accessible for those folks who are visually impaired. In the UK, since they have split from the European Union, there is the public sector's body document covering accessibility regulations that identifies the exact same criteria. So if you are a multinational publisher and you're working in the European Union and UK, you may be subject to having to meet these accessibility requirements. And then finally, similarly, in Canada, there is the Accessible Canada Act, and part of it covers digital documents and the need to be able to create them in a format that can be used by folks who have disabilities. The key specification that's involved in all of these underpinning how people are evaluating accessibility and what goes into the legislation are almost always references to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.1. These are created under the W3C and can be available online. Just a little quick Google link, Google search would be able to get you for that. What these mandates mean for publishers and organizations hosting web content is that content must meet the WCAG 2.1 requirements. Now, the one cautionary note, there are different levels of accessibility within the WCAG 2.1 requirements. They go from level A to level AAA, AAA being the most accessible content that is present. Most publishers that Apex works with and most publishers who are striving to be able to make their content online are targeting a level AA standard. That means it's not the minimal level of accessibility that would be found on the web. It is a higher level than that, and it allows and covers all of those things that would be necessary for someone who's visually impaired to be able to work with the book. What this also means is quite frequently, publishers and organizations hosting web content need to hire skilled accessibility experts or work with vendors who have that expertise. It also means they definitely have to update current material that is online or being distributed so that it is accessible. Potentially, it could mean that the legacy documents that a publisher has may need to be remediated. In some instances, those can be remediated on demand. So if there's a very, very low use case associated with the documents, it may be sufficient to be able to have commitment to the organizations that you're working with. For instance, if it's a library, at an academic institution, the student needs to be able to get access to a book in an accessible format. And it's a book that's already been in print. It's already been a book that has maybe a PDF file version of it, but that's not an accessible PDF version. You as a publisher may be contacted, and then at that point in time, may be requested to make an update to make the document accessible. All of this means that there are potential workflow changes that could be involved in the overall process. If you're working wholly with a vendor and the vendor is taking care of all of those things, it may mean that you need to work with your vendor just to bring things up to speed, or you may need to find a vendor who is qualified to be able to create accessible EPUBs or accessible PDF files. This does have impact on authors as well. It could mean that there is a change associated with workflow, and this is something that's very important for publishers to consider. One of the key underpinnings with being able to make text content accessible for folks who are visually impaired is that those text inclusions need to be coded in Unicode fonts, full Unicode fonts. This means that older legacy fonts that may be present that aren't Unicode mapped fully cannot be used. If those fonts are present inside of the documents that are rendered or created, then that's not going to be something that will translate cleanly when it comes time for having text to voice translations. Another area where it's important to be able to consider having author involvement in from a publisher perspective, and an author should be prepared, is the possibility of supplying alternative text for images. Alternative text for images means that there is a description associated with an image, so that someone who cannot see the image is clearly understanding what that image is covering and what that image is entailing. So it is simple. It could be a simple description. It could be something that's more involved, especially if the text is, the image is a flow chart, which may have multiple complex steps. It is a very good idea for publishers to be involving their authors in this process, because then you have a content expert that's going to be generating that description. And it may be something that your author is not familiar with and how they would be able to adapt to it. So going accessible. What kinds of things are advantages with going accessible, and what can this help in terms of an organization? One of the key advantages with going accessible with your documents is that your organization is promoting inclusion. There has been strong push across the breadth of the governmental organizations that I described before, to make sure that there are not people that cannot get access to materials. So inclusion is a very, very high priority. Inclusion and accessibility will support people who are blind, have low vision, or have low vision capability. But other folks that you may not be thinking of straight off the bat would be folks who are in older reader categories. As we age, it is not uncommon for us to have more and more difficulties with being able to see. Folks get cataracts, it starts to create low vision difficulties or problems. So there's an age-related requirement for an age-related aspect of inclusiveness by making sure that your documents, your books are accessible. In addition, colorblind readers can have great deals of difficulty being able to see text that is not present in a document that's been designed with accessibility in mind. In cases where you have headings inside of a book, where you have pages with background coloring that is having the text sit on top of it, what may work well for someone who has no visual difficulties may look completely unreadable and not be able to be interpreted at all by someone who's colorblind. So there are requirements associated with going accessible that help people who are colorblind to be able to read things. In an area with inclusion that folks tend not to think about with accessibility, it has to do with deaf readers. Most people think, well, if I made my text accessible, someone can listen to it and plainly get that. But there are more and more interactive books that are created, or interactive websites that are associated with books, so that there are audio and video inclusions that go along with the book. Those embeds will benefit greatly by having alt text. So it allows an individual to be able for an audio file to have a description, or it could be in the form of a readable transcript that would be provided, or closed captioning that would be audible for someone who is watching a video. Other advantages, there's enhanced user experience through design and focus on that. One of the interesting things that we found in working with publishers and talking with publishers about the design experience is that you can reach simplifications associated with some of the designs that get put into place that increase standardization. And that doesn't mean that you have a rubber stamp book every time going through, but you have standard treatments for different types of objects that are going to be put inside of the files, inside of the books. And those standardized treatments can lead to efficiencies associated with workflow. They can also lead to efficiencies in being able to navigate and move about inside of a digital document. And that's the next category that's listed here. Navigation and structural hierarchy. We have some publishers whom we do work for creating accessible EPUBs that take the EPUB as a container And then they explode the EPUB so that it is available as a book that can be navigated completely through the browser off of their website, off of their host platform. So by ensuring that you have proper structural hierarchy, proper page titles and markup, by making sure that there are clear heading levels, and improving any kind of navigation with lists and tables, folks who are visually impaired have a much greater opportunity to be able to successfully understand the content. And there is a great deal of ability for folks to be able to search and navigation through that document utilizing online tools. So all of those things combine to be able to increase the opportunity for adding metadata to the digital book and making it more discoverable, and being able to share that content with search company partners. Paths to document accessibility are two primary ones. And I want to contrast these two because it's important associated with the title of the presentation. Remediation is the first path. This is starting with what you've got and starting with what your existing processes may be producing. Often that means you're left with a print PDF as being the single composite entity that contains everything associated with the book. It's a conversion process to do remediation. And as we had mentioned about Unicode fonts before, it may require font replacement if you're going to remediate a book in order to bring it up to an accessible standard. It may be difficult to solve certain design issues that are present in the book. Some of these could be the color contrast issues that we had described before. There may also be navigation issues that are difficult to be able to resolve because of overlays and other types of presentational material that could create a highly magazine-ish look, but with no clear way to be able to navigate a user from point A to point B through potentially a series of images in a collage format, something like that on a page. So there needs to be some navigation, then it will be added in. It requires a combination of software skill and technical skill and human skill to be able to do this. Taking a print PDF and being able to push a button with something like Adobe Acrobat, utilizing its tools to create an accessible file, will only get you partway to the end solution. And the folks at Adobe are quite cognizant of that. So there are editing tools that are provided within that software to be able to make corrections and adjustments to what the software is able to detect and use. It can be expensive if you're going through the full remediation path. It certainly can be expensive if you need to be able to achieve high quality and there are problems in the source PDF with regard to font embedding and the overall layout or structure of the document. There can also be expense involved if alt text is required for images and there is no alt text that's available. That could be expensive on the behalf of the publisher trying to create that alt text. It can be also a cost that is borne with paying a vendor to do the same. In a born digital world, what you're starting with are fresh manuscripts and they're being produced as an accessible end product. You get the print PDF, but you also can generate accessible end products. One of the big benefits here is that you have author involvement and you can use that person as a subject area expert to assist with things like alt text. You can also use your interaction as an editor to be able to increase the quality of the content and help to ensure that the structural design of the book is going to work in a manner that will be both accessible and be good from a print production perspective. It is possible in this to be able to build some of the cost of accessibility into the process, so you're not doing a remediation effort at the end to get to a good end product. And it's always recommended that when you're creating born digital products, that you work with a Benetech Global Certified Accessible Vendor. A global Benetech Global Certified Accessible Vendor is a vendor who has demonstrated that their production processes are going to create an accessible EPUB 3 file that will pass through DAISY ACE checker and will pass through careful inspection by the team at Benetech in order to ensure that the output is going to meet all accessibility requirements for those EPUB 3. It's a relatively high bar to be able to hit and be able to do that thoroughly and successfully. Specifications associated with the accessible files. I'm going to give you two categories, PDF UA, Universal Accessibility. This was a form of PDF that was generated under ISO 32001, section 14.8. It's a tag PDF, and the requirements associated with it describe some of the quality parameters that are necessary to be able to make a PDF truly accessible. It is complementary with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that we had described or talked about earlier. For EPUB, it's important to go with the Accessible EPUB 3 specifications. These are based on HTML5. They're also WCAG 2.1 compatible. And within the EPUB specification, there are additional semantic descriptions that are added, which are pertinent to books. These can help considerably with navigation. And in this case, I'm talking about markers inside of the tagging that identify that the section is a chapter, the section is associated with the front matter, that a section is a block quote or is a pull quote that's present inside of the publication. All of those pieces of metadata, if read by a screen reading support tool and then verbally identified to a blind reader, help that reader understand the content that they're seeing in the context of the overall book. Assessment. How do we judge whether a book is accessible or not? And I list three different categories for this for you to be aware of. First is with PDF. The stalwart that most people utilize is the Adobe Acrobat Accessibility Checker. It's built into Adobe Acrobat, the professional version. It allows you to be able to evaluate an EPUB very quickly against 32 categories of different checks. And overall, it does a good job. In fact, it flags up a very nice report that allows you to be able to know what things you need to go in and check manually, because it's not possible to do so through software alone. For instance, there may be the presence of alt text, but the quality of that alt text is something that requires a person to take a look at. There may be other instances where you have to go through and be able to check things like color contrast. And that may involve using separate software to do screen captures and make sure that the color contrast for text with a color background is going to be something that's clear and easily visible to a person that is visually impaired. The Pac-3 Pdf Checker is another checker that is available. It's also very good. It's a freeware checker that you can download. So just search for Pac-3 Pdf Checker. And it also issues a very nice report that you are able to use. It goes one step further than the Acrobat Accessibility Checker in that you can get a very nice document tree if you're not comfortable with navigating the tag tree that's inside of Acrobat Pro. The Pac-3 Checker does this for you. For EPUB, the current version of EPUB Check, which is a standard tool for evaluating whether the EPUB is compliant with the EPUB 3.0 guidelines. The current version is 4.2.5. This is available on GitHub, so all you have to do is search for EPUB Check 4.2.5 and you can find it. The DAISY ACE Checker is released by daisy.org. Daisy.org, for those of you who aren't familiar, is an organization that has long provided services to be able to support those who are visually impaired or blind. And the ACE checker will evaluate an EPUB against all of the quality criteria that are required for it being accessible or not. It will flag up cases where there are violations. It will flag up things that are of concern. Underlying the DAISY ACE checker for many of its checks are the checks that are used by the DeCube University toolset. And then finally, Pagina EPUB Checker does a similar kind of check to the EPUB Check 4.2.5, and it does so with a nice little GUI interface. EPUB Check 4.2.5, you have to be comfortable using some command line pieces. And the final application I list here is Microsoft Word. And I put in Microsoft Word because it has a built-in accessibility checker And that accessibility checker will help an author to be able to complete content changes, content updates inside of the publication that they're creating in manuscript form. So prior to getting into a publisher's workflow, authors using Microsoft Word can use the built-in accessibility checker to be able to do this, including adding alt text. So some resources that are available. These are resources that I had made reference to previously. There are a couple for the PDFs. There's the Adobe site for accessibility. There's the ISO standard for PDF that's listed here. I give the DAISY link, the link to the EPUB 3 spec, and then the GitHub link to be able to get to EPUB check. Finally, I give a link for alt text and math. This can be very, very useful for authors. Diagram Center provides information on how to be able to create good, accessible alt text and how to be able to create accessible math and what's important with that. Diagram Center is an offshoot of the work done by the folks, good folks at Benetech. And that's my contact information. Greg Suprock, Head of Solutions Architecture. It's my email address. Feel free to contact me, or feel free to ping our website or go through the booth portal, talk with one of our reps if you're interested in some more information or additional information. And the rest of this is a little bit about the company. We've been around for 30 years. We have multiple locations in India. As part of our business continuity plan, we make sure that we have multiple locations. And we cover a wide range of services from pre-press through accessibility services, content conversion. And we work with not only publishers, we work with cultural organizations like libraries, museums, and archives. Thank you very much for listening. If folks have any questions, I'm very happy to take them now.